We all know that leaders must negotiate at times with external constituents and other institutions outside of their own organization. They have to negotiate with vendors to purchase certain materials or goods. They must negotiate with potential partners, including merger and acquisition candidates. They might have to negotiate with government entities and nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups at times. But the question in this lecture is there something more prevalent in terms of negotiation within the organization that's critical to a leader's success? Do they have to negotiate with parties within their own organization at times in order to get things done? I believe they do. We're going to take a look at the circumstances in which leaders need to engage in negotiation, not just the exercise of power or influence. And we'll talk about some of the techniques that make them better negotiators as they go about the business of leading an organization. Let's start with an interesting example of someone who perhaps didn't engage in enough negotiation or in the right kinds of negotiation as they try to lead a complex organization. The example is Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard University. Larry Summers was a very accomplished economist. He was the nephew, in fact, of two Nobel winners, Kenneth Arrow and Paul Samuelson, legendary economists. And Larry himself was tenured at Harvard before the age of 30. I, in fact, learned public sector economics as an undergraduate from Larry Summers in the fall of 1989. I remember the class very well. He was a wonderful instructor, and we learned a great deal. Although I have to say, we were also a bit frightened of him. He could be tough in his response when he asked a question if you came up with an incorrect answer. And I can remember many of us shying away from ever volunteering in class. Like, there's a famous story. One of my classmates during the fall of 1989 was Sheryl Sandberg. Sheryl Sandberg is now the chief operating officer of Facebook, one of the most high-profile companies in the world these days. Now, as it turns out, Sheryl Sandberg, like me, was pretty reticent about responding to questions in class because Summers could be quite dominating in the conversation with regard to what the right answer was or what his point of view was. According to legend, Sandberg wowed him with her written exam. That she did so well on it, he'd never really heard from her in class. He was surprised. He went on to talk more with her, become her thesis advisor, and then became her mentor as she went to work for him at the World Bank and during his time as Treasury Secretary of the United States. Summers indeed moved on from his time as a professor to be chief economist at the World Bank and then to work in the Treasury Department for President Clinton, eventually becoming Treasury Secretary himself. From there, he moved on to become president of Harvard in 2001, during which time I was now on the faculty of the school. I was over at the business school, and he became president. And I can remember the day that he was appointed, and one other faculty member said to me that Larry will either be a spectacular success or he'll be a spectacular failure. They recognized that he was likely that he would have a grand vision, and that he would push forward hard, and that he had a very strong personality, and perhaps that might get him in trouble. That it's hard to change an organization that's more than 350 years old, that's very ingrained in certain ways of working and doing, and that altering that and shifting the culture would be challenging for any person, including very intelligent, very capable person like Larry Summers. Well, indeed, as he became president in 2001, he outlined a bold vision for the university right near the outset of his tenure. He called for massive investments in the physical and natural sciences, for the creation of new laboratories and investments to fund the attraction of lots of new faculty in those areas. He believed that Harvard needed to be on the cutting edge in the life sciences, for example. He called for a massive campus expansion in Allston, a borough of Boston. In fact, the university under his predecessor had gradually been accumulating land across the river from the main campus in the city of Boston as an option for future growth. Now Summers, recognizing that they had all of this land, recognized that there was potential there, that he could build laboratories and build other aspects of the campus out to allow the university to grow, because it was very constrained in the city of Cambridge, where most of its undergraduate housing and classes took place. He called for a renewed emphasis on undergraduate education. He felt that in many ways too much of the teaching had been left to graduate students, and there was a bit of a disconnect between tenured faculty and the young undergraduates at Harvard. He wanted to re-engage his senior faculty with those young people, so talented and intelligent as they were, and use that to drive new methods of teaching and instruction, new pedagogies, and to connect more with these undergraduates before they graduated. And lastly, he called for more cooperation and integration across the disciplines and across the various graduate schools. Harvard was a place that was run in a very decentralized way under his two predecessors, Derek Bok and Neil Rudenstein. They had left the deans of each of the schools to their own devices, largely, to run them as their own operation, some would say their own fiefdom. Now Summers wanted to take some more control over those various schools and disciplines. He wanted to apply interdisciplinary approaches towards certain disciplines and certain ideas. He wanted to bring people together. It's a bold vision, and in many ways a vision that lots of folks could look upon and admire. The students, in fact, loved the vision. They loved the idea of a renewed emphasis on undergraduate education. Even after Summers was pushed out as president, his popularity among the students, among the undergraduates, remained high. But he got in hot water with the faculty. Now, most people know about the controversial issues that he found himself immersed in, like his statements about women and men and their ability in the math and sciences, or his conflict with African-American scholar Cornel West. These sorts of things definitely got him in trouble with the faculty. But there's probably more to the story. In fact, it's interesting. Sociology professor Mary Waters was quoted after the faculty was thinking about a no-confidence vote, which eventually they did undertake. She said, "A strong leader is not just someone who can name a goal or force a change, but someone who can bring out the best in people and find ways to encourage teamwork." But wait a second. Think about what Summers was trying to do. You know, did he get in trouble just because of his controversial statements and his style? Or did aspects of his vision threaten parts of the faculty, part of the university? You know, who was going to move to this Alston campus? Relocating major parts of the university, a very challenging thing to undertake. Why not emphasize the humanities, said some professors. Those who taught humanities, of course. Why all the emphasis on the natural sciences? And how will we do research if we're to spend more time with undergraduates? So pushback existed because different parts of the university had their own agendas and interests, and perhaps he didn't fully recognize how much resistance there would be because of those individual interests and the power base that people had in those various units of the organization. Warren Bennis wrote an interesting article after Larry Summers was forced to resign. He said in that article, "Running a major research university today is far more complex and demanding than running any large global corporation. Even worse, university leaders," Bennis said, "possess far less power than any CEO I know." Bennis is a great leadership scholar, someone who also has served as university president. He understands the challenge of working with tenured professors you cannot fire, with having to manage many different constituencies, students and faculty, alumni and other outside foundations and the like that the university works with, and even government who helps provide funding for research. It's a difficult job. You have people working for you who don't want to manage, who don't like to manage, who've never been trained to manage, scholars who now perhaps have been asked to lead certain administrative efforts. You have to be able to negotiate, not dictate. Now that may be true for university president, and it may be a tougher job in some ways than being a CEO because you do have less power. But Bennis and others have pointed out that negotiation is critical even for those who do have more power in running their own organizations. David Lax and James Sabinius are two very accomplished negotiation scholars. Now, much of their work has talked about negotiations that take place in the realm of mergers, acquisitions, vendors buying products, and those sorts of things, even buying a car for a typical American individual. But they've also pointed out that negotiating is a way of life for managers, that you have to negotiate not just when you're talking about contracts with vendors, but also in the way you lead an organization and try to affect change. That negotiation is everywhere in leaders' work. It's not just about procurement or the contracting process or working with outside parties. It's also about what you do inside the organization, negotiating in a range of situations in which fundamentally the interests and goals of people conflict to some extent, and the interests and goals of certain subunits of the organization may conflict. So you have to negotiate in many ways as a leader. Lax and Sabinius point out that you are negotiating with superiors. Even if you're the CEO, you've got the board with whom to negotiate. You have peers and others outside of your chain of command that you must negotiate with when you're leading a unit within an organization. And of course, at times you even have to negotiate with subordinates, people who have their own goals. They might be personal objectives they're trying to pursue. They may have their own team they're trying to lead with its own interests. You have to negotiate with them because they have their own goals, they have their own sources of support and areas of discretion. Consider the concept of the firm outlined by Meyer and Richard Cyr and James March. These two scholars outlined the behavioral theory of the firm back in the early 1960s. Cyr and March wrote about a firm not being led by a single individual, the CEO, but being led by a dominant coalition of people, senior leaders who had to negotiate and bargain with one another in order to set the strategy of the firm. This notion of a dominant coalition of people has emerged time and again in the academic literature. The notion that often there is a team of powerful people who's leading an organization who are bargaining with one another and negotiating with one another, and out of that bargaining comes ultimately a set of decisions and a strategy of the firm. It's not always so clear that one person is simply dictating where the firm or institution needs to go. Graham Allison argued that this dominant coalition concept applies in government as well, that a president and his cabinet and other senior agency leaders are working in a way that often looks more like negotiation and bargaining than it does command and control. So how can we understand the challenges leaders face when they're negotiating and get a better understanding of the tactics they ought to use to negotiate more effectively? It helps here, I believe, to introduce some basic concepts from game theory. Applied economics. Why game theory? Well, game theory fundamentally helps us look at how parties with different goals and objectives, with different interests, sometimes are engaging in competition, but also can come to cooperate with one another. And ultimately, that's what we're talking about in organizations, is the notion that you are trying to elicit cooperation from people who may have competing goals. So game theory can help us think about how parties act both in one-time interactions, as well as how patterns of behavior may evolve if people are engaged in a series of repeated actions over time. Many people begin their discussion of game theory with a simple thing called the prisoner's dilemma. Many of you may have heard of this little game situation. The idea is that there are two alleged criminals caught by the police and brought into the station for questioning. They are put in two separate interrogation rooms. Each is offered a deal. If you confess and testify against your partner in this crime, you'll get no prison time, and your partner, 10 years in jail. If you each stay silent, we're going to have enough to put you away for 1 year on a more minor offense. Of course, if you both confess and testify against each other, you're each going to get 5 years in prison. So game theorists would develop a simple payoff matrix, a way of looking at the consequences of the various strategies, confess or not confess, for each party. And in so doing, they'll help try to figure out how these prisoners would behave. Well, what's the likely result? Well, game theory specialists would argue that if both people are self-interested and acting independently, that is to say, they're in separate interrogation rooms, they can't talk with one another, then they're each going to confess. Well, why is that? Because if they each confess, that's actually the best outcome from their own self-interested standpoint. So both people achieve their own individual optimal outcome based on anticipating what the other will do and deciding how to act. But if the two people were able to combine their thoughts and talk with one another, they might come out with a different outcome. In fact, their joint outcome is highly suboptimal if they act independently and strictly in a self-interested way. They could clearly benefit if they cooperated. After all, if they cooperated, they would each only get 1 year in prison. So in total, they'd spend 2 years in prison. If they each act in a self-interested way, they'll both go to prison for 5 years. So total time spent in jail is 10 years under the self-interested action strategy and only 2 years under the cooperative strategy. Now again, if they're in separate interrogation rooms and can't cooperate, they're stuck. They're in the prisoner's dilemma. So they could clearly benefit if they could cooperate. How does this relate to organizations? Well, many times in organizations, even though we can collaborate, we could actually go talk to another party and recognize that there's a more optimal outcome we could achieve. We don't see the opportunity to collaborate for joint gain. People are often framing situations as a zero-sum game. I win, you lose. We're splitting a fixed pie. And they're not recognizing win-win opportunities that are available through cooperation. As a leader, you need to recognize those situations and help people see the opportunity to actually come to a better outcome if they can cooperate and try to resolve their differences. Why is life in an organization different, though, than the prisoner's dilemma that we've just outlined? Well, clearly, it's not just that people can actually cooperate and communicate and discuss their future intentions in most organizational situations. It's more than that. Leadership is a repeated game. Leading and following doesn't involve simultaneous decision-making always. And the choices could be sequential, not simultaneous. So by repeated game, I mean the notion that we aren't just making one choice. We're thinking about our actions, but also the implications of those actions down the road. How will what we do today affect how others behave in the future? So in a real organization, it's not a one-shot deal, like the prisoners deciding how to behave when confronted by the police. We are thinking as leaders, if we negotiate effectively, about what we do, the agenda we advance today, and its short-term results and its long-term impact on how others will interact with us in the future. If we play a game, if we engage in interaction over and over again, in fact, game theorists would argue that trust and cooperation may develop over time. Robert Axelrod has studied the prisoner's dilemma at great length. He, in fact, has looked at what strategies elicit the best results if people play that game, the prisoner's dilemma, over and over again, instead of only one time. He said the strategies that elicit cooperation are the following. If you're nice first, rather than defecting first and ratting out your partner in crime, that tends to elicit cooperation. If you punish a defection by the other party by defecting yourself at least once in the next round, that elicits more cooperation. But then also if you're forgiving, if you give the other party a chance to resume cooperation after they've ratted you out the one round, then that's helpful. And being clear as you can in the signals you send is always helpful. The simplest example of these strategies is what Axelrod described as tit for tat. That is to say, you're nice, you're cooperative, and if someone cheats and is harsh on you in some way, doesn't engage in cooperation, then you sort of punish them once in the next round, tit for tat. But then you try to return to cooperation. So it turns out in organizations we can build trust and cooperation over time when we negotiate with others. Now think about the kind of situation when we're engaging in negotiation that's like this and when we have to try to cooperate if we want to get to optimal solutions. Think of a vertically integrated company. We have a manufacturing unit and a sales or retail operation. And so the manufacturing unit is producing goods that the sales organization is then trying to get customers to buy. Suppose the manufacturing unit has to decide whether to expand capacity, to build a new plant. And the sales force is deciding whether to enter a new geographic region. Well, an optimal solution for the company would be to both expand capacity and enter the new region. After all, you can't use the capacity if you don't grow into new regions. And you can't grow into new regions and fulfill customer desires if you don't have enough capacity to produce the products that are being purchased or demanded. So what we have there, though, is not a simultaneous game like the prisoner's dilemma. We have a sequential one, right? One side can act first before the other. So the manufacturing unit could decide to build capacity before the sales unit has to decide whether to go into that other region. When we're moving in order like that, sequentially, what happens is the player who has to move first should, and often does, think about how the other is going to respond, and therefore sort of reasons backward to figure out what the best strategy is for them. How does that work? To put it simply, as the manufacturing unit, you're saying, suppose I did build capacity. What would the sales force do? And if you reasoned, in fact, they would definitely go into the new region. They would expand to sell that product. Then you say, okay, well then if they're going to go into the new region, does it make sense for me to build? Yes, it does. And so you sort of look forward, figure out how people would respond to what you do, and then you reason back. Game theorists call this backward induction. Look forward, reason back. Ask yourself, what will the other party do in the future based on my actions now? And based on that answer, you decide what you'll do today. Negotiating fundamentally is about backward induction. It's about anticipating another party's response whenever you make choices. And if you do that well, you can in fact resolve conflict more effectively, get to cooperative outcomes and optimal outcomes with various constituencies within an organization. And you can achieve your own personal goals and objectives in many cases. Now, we've talked a lot about models of game theory, but why else is the real world different than game theory models? I have to remind you, right, something that sometimes the economists forget, which is that actors may not be completely rational. That is, they may not only care about maximizing things like economic profits or other concrete financial outcomes for the organization. You need to understand who the people are on the other side of the table, how they think, what they care about. Who are these decision makers? Are they folks who are purely worried about maximizing short-run profits? Or are they cared about other things? What makes them tick and what makes them happy? So if you're trying to get the support of a faculty, as Larry Summers did at Harvard, well, clearly professors worry about lots of things beyond the salary they earn or the economic well-being of the corporation, which is the university. They're worried about all sorts of things like their own prestige and status, how other academics think of them well beyond their own university, how do their peers evaluate their research. They're worried about their long-term career aspirations and the like. There's all sorts of things besides economics and besides the overall university goals and objectives that a tenure professor is concerned about. You need to know what makes them tick. What are their underlying interests and objectives? When we're negotiating with outside entities, other firms, or units within a firm, you can't think of them as monolithic. You have to remember that behind any unit of an organization or behind any outside corporation you're negotiating with, there are people. You are negotiating with, potentially competing or cooperating with, a set of people, not a monolithic block. Well, let me give you an example to help you think about that. Suppose you're competing against News Corporation if you're in the entertainment business. Now, what do you have to think about? How should you assess the situation? Well, I would argue you have to think a lot about who Rupert Murdoch is. Entrepreneur, founder, and leader of the organization. What are his values? What's his history of competition, strategic moves, and leadership? What makes him happy? Is he short-term oriented, or does he have a long-term perspective as he runs a business? And getting into the mind and shoes of Murdoch, you recognize how he might behave in response to your own moves. We need to do that with every person we interact with when we're trying to negotiate, whether it's a subordinate within our team, or whether it's a peer within the organization, or an outside entity in a merger and acquisition. The kind of person on the other side of the table matters. What they care about matters. We can't think of a unit or an organization just as monolithic. So that means we're stepping into other shoes all the time when we negotiate. We're asking, what is the other party's goal? What are their goals and objectives? What are their assumptions and mental models? How do they think about the world? What's their own history in terms of their career or their organization? And what are their capabilities as well as their weaknesses? I'll give you an interesting example about a company who had to think about this as they were charting their strategy, as they were building their organization. Today, one of the most profitable airlines in the world is an Irish firm called Ryanair. Many of you know about them. They're a low-cost, extremely low-budget airline that provides bare-bones service but offers very, very low fares. And they've been incredibly successful from a profit standpoint. Well, when they were launched, they began by serving the London-Dublin route in Europe. And they were going to compete against British Airways and Aer Lingus. British Airways, the dominant British airline, previously owned by the government, now having gone through some privatization at the time, and Aer Lingus, the national airline of Ireland. So here's this tiny little upstart launched by the Ryan brothers and guided by a man named Michael O'Leary in those early days, who's now CEO of the company still. And you have to think about how should they plot their strategy. And to do it well, they've got to think about, well, what might the other players do? What might the incumbents do in response to us? And you have to consider not just the economic incentives of those players, but also their values. You have to consider their history, their beliefs, their mindsets. Who are these managers? If you look at it strictly from an economic standpoint, you could argue we're a tiny upstart. We're only going to fly a few flights a day. Unlikely that the incumbents would launch a big price war to attack us. After all, to do so, they'd be dropping fares across the board, and that would cost them millions and millions of dollars of profit on many, many routes that they fly, many, many flights that they fly. But in fact, if you look at it beyond just the economics, you say, how would someone like Aer Lingus be likely to react? For example, think about what their mission statement was at the time. It said we want to be safe, efficient, reliable, and profitable. Notice that profit is the last word in their mission statement. They have a history as a national carrier. There's national pride at stake. If you think about the organization, what it's all about, you might conclude that even though economically it might mean huge losses to preserve their position, they might in fact be likely to engage in a price war. And ultimately there were big drops in prices in that market. So when we're negotiating internally, we are thinking about those sorts of issues. We're thinking about who we're trying to persuade, with whom do you have to cooperate or resolve a dispute, what are their economic motives, and what are their non-economic motives. Think about being at a corporate office and you've engaged in a diversification strategy and you've got different units of the organization and you think there are synergies between and among those units. And it may be beneficial, in other words, for multiple parties to cooperate on some project. There will be benefits from working together. That's what we mean by synergy. But that doesn't mean that the business unit leaders will readily cooperate. Sometimes they need a nudge from the corporate office. Non-economic factors can get in the way in these types of internal negotiations. Even though it's in their best interest from a profit standpoint to work together, there may be all sorts of emotional, interpersonal reasons why those people aren't cooperating, and you have to help them work through that as a leader. In closing, I want to tell you about an interesting, really fascinating study done by Jeff Weiss, Aram Danigian, and Jonathan Hughes. They looked at how officers in Afghanistan negotiated with locals. Remember that in the war in Afghanistan, as well as in Iraq, American military officers faced an incredible challenge. As they were fighting insurgency, they were worried about discovering information that would help them understand who were the insurgents, where were they hiding. This was not an enemy that was out there in the open at all times, easy to find and to battle. This was a very different kind of war. And you've heard a lot about how we had to win over the local population who wanted peace in order to fight these insurgents. But it took a lot of effort, and we needed information from them, tips, to help us in fighting them. Now, what these authors said was they witnessed in their study many incorrect methods in these negotiations that officers were engaging in Afghanistan with local leaders, local people. The incorrect approach was to see them assuming they had all the facts and assuming they knew the other side's motivation, and making open-ended or unilateral offers or even threats to the local population. You saw them at times trying to buy a good relationship or buy information, and it didn't work out, using money effectively to bribe people into telling them where the insurgents were hiding. And you saw them not actually working hard enough to anticipate how their actions would be perceived by others. What's a better strategy? Well, these scholars and West Point professors and consultants looked at the approaches that seemed to work most effectively and compared it to the ineffective methods. They said the better strategies were ones where officers got the big picture and they were curious, humble, and open-minded. They tried to uncover what was important to the other parties, to these local citizens, and collaborate with them. They tried to elicit genuine buy-in, asking them, what do you think we should do? Appealing to their sense of fairness, and asking them together to consider constituent perspectives. How can we each explain this to our colleagues, they would ask the locals. How will we explain this agreement back to other officers in the military? How will you explain it to other peers in your community? They tried to build trust first before worrying about making concessions or offers or threats. And they focused on process, not just the issue they were trying to resolve, slowing down the pace, avoiding threats, trying to get some agreement on how they should go about making collaborative decisions at times. They tell the story, a disguised example, of First Lieutenant Daniel Dubé. His platoon came under attack near a village of Azro. Anti-coalition forces disappeared into shelters, and they had no idea exactly where the insurgents were hiding. While searching, this lieutenant and his troops found 25 women and children huddled in a room. Now, they wanted information from them, and they needed it quickly if they were going to find these insurgents before they escaped without being able to be caught. And when they first approached these women and children huddled in the room, one of the women barked, "There are no bad guys here. No one was firing at you." And she wanted to shoo them away. And this lieutenant took a very interesting approach. He took off his dark glasses. He put the weapon he had on his back. He knelt down to these women and children who were sitting on the floor. He reassured them that the home was secure. He acknowledged their fear. He asked why they were clustered together. He took notes as they talked, and they gave him info. And he built a relationship and promised to follow up with them, and he did. And through that relationship, he got a lot of valuable information and was able to catch many insurgents. What are our takeaways from this of our first of two lectures on negotiation? You must, as a leader, understand the powerful units and subunits within your organization. Understand their interests. How will others act? What are their goals and objectives? Put yourself in their shoes. Remember, they won't always act rationally. They may not always only care about economic motivations. They may have other interests. Don't assume you know what they're thinking, and don't threaten them as your primary means of negotiating with them. Acknowledge their fears and concerns. Get to their level and build a trusting relationship. Yes, you want to pursue your own interests, but recognize they have goals too. Recognize where they aren't aligned and work to find cooperative arrangements that lead to optimal solutions.